I spent 3 years studying war, violence, and destruction at university. Outwardly speaking, it was called human history, but inwardly I was going through a deeply uncomfortable and often quite confronting relationship to my own violent side. It was a very strange experience because something was happening on a near daily basis. Imagine a day where you're in the library, reading yet another book. You're reading a book like The Roots of War and Terror by Anthony Stevens, and you're going through these genocidal stories, these stories of massacre and horror, and sometimes I would openly cry in the library. It would touch me so deeply. And yet I'd also go back that evening after the studies were done, and I would relax and unwind by turning on my computer and watching a couple episodes of my favourite shows where manly men would stab each other with swords and spears, and I would call that entertainment. How could I simultaneously abhor and condemn the violence I was reading about, but also praise and celebrate and entertain the violence that I was consuming? Why do I have such a violent fascination? And why do you have the same violent fascination? Because very few of us would ever take a life from cruelty. Maybe there's been a moment in your past where you've hurt someone with your actions or your words. I mean, there has. Everyone has hurt somebody at some point in their life. But you've probably never taken a life, and you probably never will. But what would happen if someone threatened your life? Or even worse, what if you saw someone threatening directly in front of you the life of your child or someone that you deeply cared about? You'd probably be moved towards doing something very destructive. Today we're going to have a conversation where I'm going to bring forwards 3 incredible books to help us unravel this question of violence, aggression, and ultimately the shadow psychology about our own violent side. Today's video is prompted by a very interesting and thankfully much anticipated question from Hannah. Because I studied history at university, it was mainly a lot of war studies and a lot of studies about, as I said, genocide and conflict, but I've yet to do a video on war consciousness. So Hannah thankfully prompted the question. Today she asked, it's about the role of war consciousness in human history. It's obviously something that still resonates strongly with many, or shows like Vikings wouldn't be so popular. But what role should it play going forwards? Is it something we can and should shift, or is it needed? What would its healthy expression be? I ruminate on this quite a bit. Well, Hannah, I can relate because I also ruminated on that question for about 3 years and about the last 5 years or so as well. So it's been a lot of my time and energy spent on the same kind of question, which makes this a very difficult video to make because I've got far too much that I want to say for about 20 minutes. So I've narrowed it down to 3 books and a general idea that we're going to define aggression. There's 2 different types of aggression. We're going to go into war consciousness, and then we're going to look at the archetypal reality that our violent and destructive impulses are moving us towards. This is more of the jungian depth therapy. We're going to finish on that. Let's firstly begin by framing the conversation at the fundamental foundation, which is recognizing that humans are deeply destructive. We're going to begin with The Roots of War and Terror by Anthony Stevens, a fantastic book if you're looking for a very readable, very engaging psychological take on the nature of human malevolence, evil, cruelty, and all of these very shadowy topics. But an introductory quote that's important to kick things off with. It's about war, because we need to go from war as a collective to then bring it back to the individual. So, quote from the book. War brings out both the best and the worst in us. Bit of a controversial start. It mobilizes our deepest resources of love, compassion, courage, cooperation, and self-sacrifice. It also releases our capacities for xenophobia, hate, brutality, sadism, destruction, and revenge. When human beings perceive themselves as being under external threat, they close ranks. And then this incredibly confronting statistic on the next page. The statistics of history are in line with this assumption about human history being defined by warfare. Between 1500 BC and AD 1860, so about 3,000 years, there were in the known world, there were an average of 13 years of war to every year of peace. 13 years of war to every single year of peace. And between 1820 and 1970, the major nations of the world went to war on average every 20 years. That is to say, once per generation. And later in the book, he says that during that same time period, that 3,000-year period, there were roughly 8,000 known peace treaties, with the average peace treaty lasting 2 years. The war to end all wars, even from the most basic level of one tribe against another tribe, and the village elders come together, let's say 3,000 years ago, and they sit down in the chief's hut and sign the peace treaty and say, too many of our sons have died, this is the end of the war, we will never do this again. 2 years on average. Sure, maybe there was a 100-year peace treaty that worked in a certain isolated case, but we saw even with the First World War ending in 1918 and the punishing nature that we had towards the German people, and then how that went towards Germany's rage in the 1930s, and it was only 20 years later until the Second World War began in 1939, and then the war ends in 1945. We have things like the Korean War and the beginnings of the Cold War, and we have a variety of violent conflicts extending all the way through the war to end all wars. And here we are right now at the time of recording, and there's another active war in the east of Europe. Human history is truly defined by war and peace, but I would say if we pay attention to the fact that 13 years of conflict and 1 year of peace is about the balance, that there's something about human history, which means that there's something about humanity which has a default magnetism towards warring. So how can we understand this? Well, let's turn to the second book of the video, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, which is an excellent, excellent psychological take by Erich Fromm. The reason that this book is in my library is that I truly believe this to be the best single source resource on human destructiveness. That's why it's called The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Erich Fromm goes close to the bone in regards to understanding evil, malevolence, and aggression in particular. But we need to understand that there's not just one type of aggression, because if we believe that aggression is always something which is bad, something which is always leaning towards destruction for the sake of destruction, then we're going to keep projecting our own violent side either into the entertainment that we consume or into people who we call evil people, not paying attention to the fact that we, of course, have our own aggressive drives. And if you're ever into the therapeutic notion of what it means to actually unlock your aggression, it means the ability to push away or to strike and be able to defend yourself. So let's go into the book and expand on this idea just a little bit more, the two sides of aggression. Okay, talking about biological aggression, which is adaptive, and malignant aggression. Okay. The distinction between benign, defensive, and malignant, destructive aggression calls for a further and more fundamental distinction. I actually got the wrong page here, excuse me. I think we need to go a few pages back, or maybe a few pages forwards. Yes, I've got it. Let's start again. From the book, we must distinguish in man two entirely different kinds of aggression. The first, which he shares with all animals, is a phylogenetically programmed impulse to attack or to flee. When vital interests are threatened, this defensive, benign aggression is in the service of the survival of the individual and the species. It is biologically adaptive, which means that it developed in a way which supports life and ceases when the threat has ceased to exist. So the first type of aggression, it is an automatic, self-preserving, defensive impulse. Someone's coming towards you and you say, "Get off me," and you aggressively push them out. If you go back to the Latin root of aggression, it comes from aggregare, which means to move towards. Energetically, you're moving that energy either away from you or you're moving towards a goal. It's not necessarily violence if you go back to the root of the aggressive gesture. So we've got benign aggression on the one side, and on the other side, back to the book, the other type, malignant aggression, is destructiveness and cruelty. It is specific to the human species and virtually absent in most mammals. It is not phylogenetically programmed and not biologically adaptive. It has no purpose, and its satisfaction is lustful. Most previous discussion of the subject has been aggravated by the failure to distinguish between these two kinds of aggression, each of which has different sources and different qualities. And what's happening now is basically here, and the final quote that I'll go into, and then we'll bring it back out. Bit of a messy take, but I highly recommend that you read the book for yourself. There are simply, well, so many highlighted pages I couldn't even capture it on camera. It's well worth reading. Whether man's dominant passion is love or whether it is destructiveness depends largely on social circumstances. These circumstances, however, operate in reference to man's biologically given existential situation, and the needs springing from it are not to an infinitely malleable, undifferentiated psyche, as environmentalist theory assumes. The reason that I went into that final quote, putting the book down, is that we need to recognize that there is something inside of humanity which is programmed to be aggressive. We cannot repress the violent side of our psyche, but we need to understand what differentiates between the defensive impulse and more of that destructive, sadistic impulse. I disagree with Eric Fromm. Later in the book, he does make some particular exceptions that humans are the only violent species. We've seen through literally YouTube videos that you can find for yourself of various baboon tribes that go out on killing parties, and they form little raids, and they will unnecessarily kill the animals that they are going against. And also we can see clips of lions and cheetahs and other large feline predators who will toy with prey. And I don't know whether that is necessarily the biologically adaptive aggression just for the sake of hunting. That's up to debate. I am not an anthropologist, so please have your own opinion. If you have something to share it in the comments section. Nonetheless, we need to understand that the distinction between what makes us defend ourselves and what makes us overexert ourselves can often be the sense of boredom. It's a crucial moment in the video, because if we can understand the boredom element, we can go all the way back to Hannah's question about why are we so fascinated with shows like Vikings? Why did Game of Thrones get so big? Well, the two main themes, as everyone knows who's watched these kinds of programs, is violence and adult encounters. It's lust, and it's the general pattern of high energy destruction and creation, or at the very least all of the drama surrounding those two acts. I'm trying not to say the word beginning with S to keep this video friendly, because you can talk about genocides and massacres, but not say that word, otherwise YouTube's gonna say no, we don't talk about that. You can talk about the genocide in Rwanda, but you can't say the S word. Bit of a strange moment there, isn't it? Because actually it's a shadow censorship of human intimacy, human generativity, let's say, not S ending with Y, but those two words, as opposed to the acceptance of violence. How come a 10-year-old boy can watch a cartoon that shows great acts of violence, but not acts of two adults coming together in the bedroom? It speaks deeper into the psyche, but we need to understand that boredom, at its very core, is what drives us towards consuming material which excites us. There's a really good point in the first book that I hold up, The Roots of War and Terror by Anthony Stevens, where he's talking about how men enlisted in both the First World War and the Second World War widely because of this sense of boredom and monotony. If you look at the economic situations for the majority of main players in both of those wars, so the European powers especially, and also America, you'll see that the average man between 16 and 35, which is the main combatants in any war, wasn't necessarily being the most fulfilled. They had something to go after. They felt like war would be a bit of an adventure of a lifetime. I've never been to war personally, but I can definitely relate as a man, even if we're relating to the entertainment aspect, that when you watch the charge of the Rohirrim in Lord of the Rings, and the king is in front of the thousands of men on the horses, and he's giving that final battle speech before running down into the orcs, there's something about that moment which speaks deep to the soul of men. And in the Lord of the Rings in particular, the majority of the scenes of violence are clearly good versus evil. It's these humanoid armies, well, literally human armies, sometimes elves as well, and dwarves, and all kinds of wonderful creatures in the Tolkien universe. They're going against evil, the embodiment evil as an orc, or a gremlin, a goblin, if you want to expand it to the more archetypal medieval realities. All of these demonic creatures are clearly evil. There's something in our psyche which calls us towards that driving against evil and destroying evil as good men good men are willing to die to destroy that which is evil because something inside their psyche talks towards that possibility. We've taken the core psychological drive here. From Boredom, we tap into this core psychological drive within men and also within women. Women do watch these shows like Game of Thrones and Vikings, but why is that? Why would they also participate in this very distinctly male territory? Women don't go to war. Men go to war, but women can also get swept up in the war consciousness. We need to understand more of the archetypal take, which is why I'm holding up Agna, sounds like a vampire. Anger, Madness, and the Daimonic by Stephen Diamond. And this is an exceptional archetypal book. The reason that it's on the thumbnail for today's video is that this book is going to help you turn your anger and your aggression into the creative urge to generate rather than to destroy. It's a very high-level alchemical process, but if you bear with me, we're going to figure out how to do that. But we need to firstly go into the archetypal foundation. So, a quote from the book about the nature of human archetypal fascination with war. Here we go. At least since Cain slew Abel, so this is in the biblical stories of Cain and Abel, right? The brothers who warred. At least since Cain slew Abel, the story of humankind has been a violent one. Archetypal take coming up, punctuated by war, genocide, mass murder, and malevolence. Destructiveness and violence have proven to be deep-seated, perhaps even archetypal patterns of human behavior. America itself was a child of violent conflict, conceived and born by way of anger, outrage, and stormy revolt. The subsequent annals of American history are replete with violence. The genocide of Native Americans in the name of manifest destiny, the infamous Salem witch hunts, wherein countless innocent women were pitilessly persecuted, the bloody Civil War pitting brother against brother, American against American, the vengeful lawlessness of the Wild West, the murderous malice towards blacks as well as other minority groups, and the reactive, eruptive, incendiary race riots, the shocking political assassinations, and now the senseless violence we see surrounding us on all sides. It's incredibly evocative writing. We need to understand the archetypal reality. That's the wrapping up point for this video, because now that we've accepted that we do indeed have a violent side, and there is something about human history which we cannot escape from, you are not the man or woman who's going to go above the violence that has genuinely characterized a lot of human development. We need to look deeper into the archetypal core of why we feel driven towards war consciousness. It's bringing it all the way back to that first quote of war bringing out both the best and the worst in humanity. Sure, we might pit two tribes of men against each other, and they might be fighting for land, or power, or defense. But when they're fighting, so I've heard, so I've read, it's not so much about those principles, it's about the man to his left and the man to his right. It's about fighting in community, and those heroic acts, those self-sacrificial acts that really touch us in the movies, the moments where someone stays behind and the others get to flee. Literally the moment where, we'll go with Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf's fighting the Balrog, I think, because today's questioner has Gandalf the Grey, I think that's her tag. When Gandalf is fighting Balrog, the wizard is fighting this demon from hell. He stays behind and defends the Fellowship so they can get away, and of course, he descends down into the pit, and archetypally speaking, the wisest among them, the most powerful among them, is the one who sacrifices his life, at least at that moment in the story, so that the others can get away. He gives up his life in service of the Fellowship, because the Fellowship is that which matters more than him as an individual. That is the higher ideal of war consciousness, but it's tied up in the violence of killing and destruction. Can we possibly separate the two? Yes, we can. We can take the drive towards war consciousness, the drive towards power, especially in men. Let's go with the male story. How can the man who relates to Gandalf, who wants to fight against the demons of hell, how can he truly take that energy and turn it into something which is non-literal? He doesn't need to go sign up to the army and go and fight a war against another human being, because that's another human being, not a demon. Or maybe he should take that righteous impulse inside of him and turn it towards something good for the world. Maybe he should do something like building a business or serving a community where he fights against the demons of injustice and what William James called the moral equivalent of war. What a beautiful idea. What is the moral equivalent of war? Well, many men naturally tap into this when they start going to the gym or training martial arts. They take that really intense, fiery energy and they find a safe way to express it where they get to test their character and build their strength and their integrity without causing significant harm or destruction to anyone in any way. They play with the energy. And if you read a book like Anger, Madness, and Daimonic, this idea of the daimonic is different from the demonic because it goes back to the Platonic ideal that we have a certain voice inside of our soul which has a certain essential imprint which can be used for both creative generativity and creative destruction. There are some incredible examples here, some interesting alternative histories of what would happen if someone like a certain German dictator who was in the Second World War, I don't think I can say his name on YouTube without this video being flagged, but a certain German dictator who had one of these, what if he took all of that artistic energy that didn't work out at art school and directed it towards creating incredible paintings? Well, the story would be quite different. It's a bit of a flat argument of, what if that man in particular was actually a successful artist and was successful with ladies? Would he have gone off and started one of these worst moments in human history? It's not just about him. It's multiple years of studying the World War is coming through. It's a very complex issue. The point is, at least in principle, what if every individual man and woman, but especially men, take that drive towards destruction and realize that they can turn it back on themselves, not in a self-harming way, but cut away the vices, cut away the distractions, and cut away all of those limiting narratives which keep them small. And what if they take that same aggressive impulse, maybe you've noticed in some of my videos I can get quite aggressive when speaking, and turn it towards aggressively going through the reading material and find a way to focus aggressively, destructively, and generatively on reading for 4 or 5 hours straight. What if you can take that same drive, that same hunger, and shift your war consciousness as inspired by a noble ideal, like being the equivalent of the king in your imagination, going down towards the army of the orcs, but in this case, the army of the orcs are all the distractions, all the vices, and actually the swinging of the sword is every single turning of the page. It's playing a game. It's the moral equivalent of warfare, and it's realizing that we have 2 types of aggression. We have defensive aggression and we have malignant aggression. Don't throw away all of your aggression and don't project it all onto characters in TV shows. The reason that we love watching violence is that we simultaneously don't know the consequence of real violence. Either you haven't been to war, you haven't been around. I mean, I've heard these stories and thanks to God, I've never been in a situation like this. People who grow up in very difficult, very dangerous environments, maybe a ghetto environment, or they've literally grown up in a war-torn country, they're not necessarily too fascinated by stories of gangsters and shootings. They're actually quite traumatizing. Veterans who come back from war, maybe they have 1 of 2 responses and they love gun culture and they come back and find a new way to bond with other men based on something which is less intense but still very emotionally connected, or they might completely become a pacifist. There's many different individual reactions to violence and trauma. The point is to realize that you're never going to escape it full stop. You're never going to completely diffuse your violent side. You're never going to properly integrate your shadow. It's something to really pay attention to over the course of your lifetime. You recognize just how destructive you could be if someone was hurting your child or someone that you deeply loved. I'd imagine that you could cause significant destruction to them. And I'd also, personally, based on my moral belief system, think that you should. Don't take their life if possible, but if someone's going to hurt your child, it's your duty, as a man or a woman, to defend someone who's helpless. And that's tapping into deeply instinctual and deeply archetypal energy. It's not just the good mother or the good father that defends their child, it's also the moment of Gandalf on the bridge defending against the demons. And it's unfortunate that some human beings go towards that evil side of nature and they become demonic through very poor choices. But at a certain point, people do forfeit their right to be treated with respect if they're causing acts of harm to other people. And if we can find ways to heal them, fantastic. But you also need to recognize that you projecting your shadow all the way out onto the characters in the TV shows, or maybe the criminals that you read on the news, and not recognizing your own capacity and also fascination to maybe be quite powerful and cause some harm, that's going to leave you in a very fragile situation. I've gone in so many directions in this video. Once more, I do want to recommend specifically this book, Anger, Madness and Daimonic, and also The Anatomy of Human Destruction by Erich Fromm, two of the best books. That's why I brought these out rather than about 20 other books I could have brought forwards. And it's been a wide-ranging video, but if you want to hear more videos on war consciousness and violence and destruction, please leave them in the comment section, because I feel like I've got at least 10 videos on this topic that we could go through, and we've got a few more years of making videos, so we might as well start now. Leave it in the comment section, but I hope this has been useful, and at the very least, let's all start to integrate our violent side a little bit more so it doesn't become unconscious, and then we can become warriors in the garden rather than gardeners in the war, and know when to swing a sword, and mostly keep it inside the scabbard. I'll see you over on the next video. It's over here.